You think there's nothing worse than being abandoned by your own flesh and blood in the middle of nowhere? I know better. I lived through it, but they forgot one crucial thing. I've never been the type to sit quietly while others decide my fate. They thought leaving me at that godforsaken rest stop with a $20 bill would be the end of my story. They were wrong. Dead wrong. Because sometimes, the quietest revenge is the most devastating kind. My name is Margaret Hale, and at 72 years old, I thought I knew what betrayal looked like. I was wrong. It started 3 weeks ago when Daniel, my only son, called with excitement bubbling in his voice. "Mom, Lauren and I have been planning something special for you," he said. "A family road trip, just like we used to do when Dad was alive. We want to create new memories together." My heart swelled. Since Arthur passed 4 years ago, I'd felt increasingly invisible in my own family. Daniel and Lauren were always busy with their careers, their social circles, their important lives. This invitation felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. I spent days preparing with the enthusiasm of a young bride. I baked Daniel's favorite lemon squares, the ones with the perfect balance of tart and sweet that his grandmother had taught me 50 years ago. I packed thermoses of my special herbal tea blend, chamomile, lavender, and a hint of mint. Because Lauren always complained about gas station coffee, I even dug out my old paper maps from the attic, the ones Arthur and I had marked with red circles around every diner we'd loved, every scenic overlook we'd photographed. "You don't need those, Mom." Daniel had laughed when he saw them. "We have GPS now." But I brought them anyway. There was something comforting about tracing routes with my finger, about having a backup plan. If only I'd known how desperately I'd need one. The morning of our departure, I was ready by 5:30 a.m., sitting in my kitchen with my small suitcase beside me, watching the sunrise paint the sky pink and gold. Daniel had said they'd pick me up at 6, and I didn't want to keep them waiting. By 7, I called his cell. It went straight to voicemail. Traffic, I told myself, though the roads were usually clear at this hour. By 8, I'd left 3 messages. By 9, Lauren finally answered. "Oh, Margaret," she said, and I could hear the forced surprise in her voice. "We're already on the highway. Daniel said he told you we were leaving from the northern route. We thought you were meeting us at the rest stop in Ashford Hollow." My stomach dropped. "He never said, 'Can you drive there? It's only about 2 hours from your house. We'll wait for you.'" I don't drive anymore. Not since my vision started going. They knew that. But the desperation to be included, to not be the difficult mother-in-law, made me lie. Of course. "I'll find a way." Helen Monroe, my widowed neighbor, drove me. God bless her. She didn't ask questions when I knocked on her door at 9:15. Just grabbed her keys and said, "Where to, honey?" The rest stop at Ashford Hollow was one of those forgotten places that time had left behind. Cracked asphalt, a single vending machine that probably hadn't worked since the 90s, and a bathroom that smelled like despair. Daniel's silver SUV was parked near the trees, empty. "They must be stretching their legs," I told Helen, though something cold was already creeping up my spine. I found the note tucked under the windshield wiper, Daniel's handwriting, the same careful letters I'd taught him to form when he was 5. "Mom, this isn't working out. Lauren and I need some time alone. Here's money for a bus ticket home. We'll talk when we get back." A $20 bill was paper-clipped to the note. $20, as if I were a problem that could be solved with pocket change. Helen waited with me for 3 hours. We sat on a splintered bench, watching the occasional car pass, while I called Daniel's phone again and again. When the sun reached its peak and the heat became unbearable, she gently suggested we go home. "They're not coming back, are they?" I asked her. She squeezed my hand. "No, honey, I don't think they are." The bus ride home took 5 hours. 5 hours to replay every conversation, every sign I'd missed. The way Lauren's smile never quite reached her eyes when I visited. The way Daniel had started calling me mother instead of mom. The way they'd exchanged glances when I'd offered to help with Thanksgiving dinner last year. By the time the bus dropped me off at the station near my house, it was past 8 p.m. My feet hurt, my back ached, and my heart, My heart felt like it had been carved out with a dull spoon. But the worst was yet to come. Because when Helen drove me home, when I stood at my own front door with my key in my hand, I discovered the final insult. They'd changed the locks. The key turned uselessly in my hand, once, twice. 3 times I tried, as if repetition could somehow undo this fresh betrayal. My fingers trembled against the cold metal, and I could feel Helen's worried gaze on my back. "Maybe it's just stuck," she offered gently, though we both knew better. I pressed my forehead against the door. My door. The door to the house where I'd raised my son, where I'd nursed Arthur through his final months, where every wall held 43 years of memories. The wood was cool against my skin, and I could smell the lavender I'd planted beside the porch last spring. "I have tools in my garage," Helen said. "We could—" "No." The word came out sharper than I intended. "No, thank you." Breaking into my own home, the thought made bile rise in my throat. What had I become? A problem to be locked out, a nuisance to be managed from a distance? Helen didn't leave me on that porch. She took my arm, firmly but gently, the way you'd guide someone away from a cliff's edge, and led me to her house next door. Her living room smelled of cinnamon candles and the faint mustiness that clings to houses where only one person lives. She settled me into her late husband Earl's recliner and wrapped a crocheted afghan around my shoulders. "Tea?" she asked, already moving toward the kitchen. "Something stronger, if you have it." She returned with 2 glasses of sherry, the kind proper ladies aren't supposed to admit they drink. We sat in silence for a while, the grandfather clock in her hallway marking time with solemn ticks. "I have the spare bedroom," Helen said finally. "It's yours as long as you need it." The kindness of it. This woman who owed me nothing offering what my own blood had taken away nearly broke me. I took a shaky sip of sherry and tried to make sense of it all. My phone, silent all day, suddenly buzzed. Daniel's name appeared on the screen, and my traitorous heart still leaped with hope. Maybe it had all been a terrible mistake. Maybe— "Hi, Mom." His voice was carefully modulated, the tone he used for difficult clients at his law firm. "I see you made it home safely." Home. The word tasted bitter. "You changed the locks, Daniel." A pause. I could hear Lauren murmuring in the background. "It's for your own good," he said finally. "You've been forgetful lately, leaving the stove on, misplacing things. We can't have you wandering into the house unsupervised." "Unsupervised?" My voice cracked. "It's my house." Which is why we need to talk about next steps. Lauren found a lovely assisted living community. I hung up. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped the phone. Helen reached over and gently took it from me, setting it on the coffee table. "Bastards," she said quietly. And somehow that simple profanity from this church-going 78-year-old was exactly what I needed to hear. I stayed in Helen's spare room that night, lying awake on sheets that smelled like fabric softener and strangers. The room was tidy but impersonal. A chest of drawers, a small desk, curtains with tiny violets that probably hadn't been changed since the 80s. Through the wall, I could see the shadow of my own house, dark and unwelcoming. At 3:17 a.m., I gave up on sleep and crept to the window. My garden was visible in the moonlight, the tomatoes I'd staked last month, the roses Arthur had given me for our 40th anniversary. Would Daniel let them die? Would he hire someone to tend them? Some stranger who wouldn't know that the yellow roses needed extra mulch, or that the tomatoes produced better if you played classical music nearby. The thought of my life being edited, managed, erased, it was unbearable. When dawn finally came, I was sitting at Helen's kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a legal pad. She found me there, making lists. "What are you writing?" she asked. "Everything I remember about my house. Every document, every asset, every account number I can recall." I looked up at her. "They think I'm some doddering old fool who can't remember to turn off a stove. They're wrong." Helen sat across from me, her face serious. "What are you going to do?" I thought about the $20 bill, about the changed locks, about the careful way Daniel had said, "for your own good." I thought about Lauren's fake surprise and the 3 hours I'd waited on that splintered bench like an abandoned dog. I'm going to remind them exactly who they're dealing with. I said, I spent 30 years as a bookkeeper at Brighton Mills Cooperative. I know how money works, how property works, how the law works, and I know something else they've forgotten. What's that? I smiled for the first time since finding that note under the windshield. I know where all the bodies are buried, metaphorically speaking. Of course. Helen poured herself coffee and raised her mug in a small toast. Give them hell, Margaret. Outside, the sun was rising over my locked house, painting it gold and pink like a promise, or maybe a warning. Daniel thought he'd won by changing those locks, by leaving me at that rest stop with his insulting $20. He had no idea what he'd actually done. He'd freed me from the last chains of maternal obligation. He'd transformed me from a mother into an adversary, and I'd been keeping books for longer than he'd been alive. 3 days into my exile at Helen's house, my granddaughter Emily called. Her face appeared on my phone screen, young and bright at 16, with Daniel's eyes, but thankfully not his duplicity. Not yet. Anyway. Grandma, she chirped. How was the trip? Dad said you decided to come home early because you weren't feeling well. The lie slid so easily from her lips that I wondered how long she'd been practicing it. Or maybe she believed it. Maybe that was worse. Did he now? I kept my voice neutral, the way I used to when catching discrepancies in the company ledgers. Yeah, he said you got confused at the rest stop and they had to arrange for someone to bring you home. She leaned closer to the camera, and I could see her bedroom behind her, posters of bands I didn't recognize, clothes strewn across a chair, normal teenage chaos. Are you okay? Mom's worried you might need to see a doctor. Mom's worried. Lauren, who'd left me standing in that desolate parking lot with a $20 bill. I'm fine, sweetheart, I said. Because what else could I say? How could I explain to this child that her parents had orchestrated my abandonment? Emily chatted for a few more minutes about school, about her boyfriend, a secret I'd been keeping from Daniel for months, about a concert she wanted to attend. Normal grandmother-granddaughter conversation, except for the poison underneath it all. Oh, she said just before hanging up. Dad wanted me to tell you that you'll be getting some papers soon. Something about making sure you're taken care of. He's such a good son. Isn't he, Grandma? After she hung up, I sat staring at the blank screen for a long time. A good son. My good son who was apparently preparing legal documents to have me declared incompetent. The papers arrived 2 days later. Helen brought them in from her mailbox. They'd been delivered to her address, probably because Daniel knew I was staying there. The return address was from Brennan and Associates, a law firm I recognized from Daniel's professional circle. Want me to stay while you read them? Helen asked. I shook my head. Some humiliations need to be faced alone. The language was dense, legal, designed to confuse, but I'd spent 3 decades translating financial documents, and I knew how to read between the lines. Petition for conservatorship, declaration of incapacity, medical evaluation required, my son, my baby boy who I'd sung to sleep, who I'd taught to tie his shoes, who I'd supported through law school by taking on extra bookkeeping clients, was trying to have me declared mentally incompetent. The grounds were laughable if they weren't so cruel. Recent episodes of confusion and memory loss. The time I'd forgotten to turn off the stove? I'd been making soup when Daniel called to say Arthur's headstone had been vandalized. Any person would have been distracted. Inability to manage financial affairs. This from the boy who'd needed me to bail him out of credit card debt twice in his 20s. Wandering and becoming lost. Apparently, being abandoned at a rest stop now counted as wandering. The worst part was the affidavit at the back. Lauren's signature was there, of course, swearing to my declining mental state, but there were others too. Neighbors I'd thought were friends. The mailman who I'd given Christmas cookies to for 15 years. All of them had signed statements about my concerning behavior. I thought about calling Daniel, demanding an explanation. But what was the point? He'd made his position clear when he changed those locks. Instead, I called Emily back. Grandma, she seemed surprised. Twice in 1 week. Is everything okay? Just wanted to hear your voice, I said, which wasn't a lie. Tell me, Sweetheart, what exactly did your parents tell you about my health? She hesitated. I could practically see her looking over her shoulder, checking if her parents were within earshot. Just that you've been forgetting things, she said finally, her voice lower. Mom said you left the gas on last month and almost burned the house down. The gas? I kept my voice steady. We have an electric stove. Emily? Silence. Then, oh, what else did they tell you? That you've been giving money to scammers, that you sent $5,000 to someone claiming to be from the IRS. Another lie. The only large withdrawal I'd made recently was to pay for Arthur's headstone repairs, something I had receipts for, filed properly in my desk drawer, the desk I could no longer access. Grandma. Emily's voice was very small now. What's really going on? I wanted to tell her everything, but she was 16, caught between her parents and her grandmother. It wasn't fair to put her in that position. Just some family business to sort out, I said instead. Nothing for you to worry about. After we hung up, I sat with the legal papers spread across Helen's kitchen table. Each page was another nail in the coffin they were building for me. Sign here and surrender your autonomy. Sign here and admit you're no longer capable of managing your own life. Sign here and disappear quietly into whatever facility they'd chosen for you. Like hell, I said to the empty room. Helen appeared in the doorway. Bad news? I showed her the papers. She read them slowly, her lips pursing tighter with each page. The nerve, she said finally. The absolute nerve. They want me to appear for a medical evaluation next Tuesday, I said, with a doctor of their choosing. Of course. Will you go? I gathered the papers up, tapping them against the table to align the edges. Such official-looking documents. Such official-looking lies. Oh, I'll go, I said, but not alone, and not unprepared. That night, I lay in Helen's spare room and made plans. They thought they were dealing with a confused old woman who'd lost her edge. They'd forgotten that I'd spent 30 years catching people who tried to cook the books, finding the holes in stories that didn't add up. They'd forgotten that before I was Daniel's mother, before I was Arthur's wife. I was Margaret Fielding, the girl who'd put herself through community college by working 3 jobs, who'd learned bookkeeping from correspondence courses because no one would teach a woman back then. They'd forgotten who I really was. But I was about to remind them. The attic access in Helen's house was through a pull-down ladder in the hallway ceiling. I hadn't been up there in years, not since I'd helped her store Earl's things after he passed, but I remembered seeing boxes from my house up there, things I'd asked her to keep when Arthur was sick and I'd needed the space for medical equipment. You sure you should be climbing up there? Helen asked, holding the ladder steady. I'm 72, not dead, I said, though my knees protested with each rung. The attic was dusty and hot, even in the morning. Weak light filtered through a small window, illuminating boxes labeled in my own careful handwriting. Christmas decorations, tax records, Arthur's book, and there, in the far corner, a box simply marked, Important Papers. I dragged it to the ladder. Muscles I'd forgotten I had complaining about the effort. Inside, wrapped in plastic to protect against moisture, were documents I'd almost forgotten about. Our original mortgage papers, insurance policies, and at the very bottom, a manila envelope I'd sealed 23 years ago. Arthur's will, his real will. Not the simple one-page document Daniel thought was the only copy. I sat on Helen's living room floor, the papers spread around me like a paper fortress. Arthur had been many things. A devoted father, a mediocre golfer, a man who cried at sappy commercials. But he'd also been shrewd. Maybe it came from growing up poor, or maybe from watching his own siblings fight over their parents' meager estate. Either way, he'd planned for contingencies I'd never wanted to imagine. Upon evidence of coercion, manipulation, or abandonment by our heirs, the will read in Arthur's attorney's precise language. All previous inheritance arrangements shall be rendered null and void. There was more, so much more. Arthur had created what he'd called a nuclear option, a trust that could be activated under specific circumstances, moving all assets beyond the reach of our children if they proved unworthy. He'd even included a clause about attempted conservatorship proceedings being considered evidence of coercion. You clever, paranoid man. I whispered to the papers. How did you know? Because he had known. I remembered now the conversation we'd had, maybe 6 months before his diagnosis. His friend Malcolm had been forced into a nursing home by his children, his house sold, his belongings scattered to the wind. Arthur had come home from visiting him with a grim expression. Promise me something. Maggie, he'd said. If the kids ever try to pull something like that, you fight. You fight dirty if you have to. I'd laughed it off then. Daniel would never. I'd assured him. Our son loved us. The will specified that activation of the trust required 3 things: evidence of abandonment or coercion, the signature of the surviving spouse, and the witness of an attorney who'd known the family for at least 10 years. Edward Price, Arthur's attorney and poker buddy. He'd retired 5 years ago, but I knew he still lived in town. His number was in my address book, the physical one I carried in my purse, because some habits die hard. Edward? His voice was gravelly when he answered, like he'd been napping. This is Margaret Hale. Margaret! How are you? I heard Daniel was handling things for you now. The grapevine in our small town was efficient, apparently. That's actually why I'm calling, I said. I need to discuss Arthur's will, the full will. A pause. I see. When? As soon as possible. How about tomorrow, 10 o'clock? I can come to you if transportation is... I'll be there. I cut him off. I was tired of people assuming I was helpless. That evening, I called my former colleague from Brighton Mills, Sylvia Dalton. She'd handled our pension fund before retiring, and if anyone knew how to structure finances to be legally bulletproof, it was her. They did what? Sylvia's voice was sharp when I explained the situation. Oh, Margaret, what do you need? Help, I admitted. The kind of help that keeps assets safe from grabbing hands. The Silver Pine Trust structure, she said immediately. I've set up 3 of them for other women in your situation. Completely legal, completely airtight. Your assets go in, but only you control what comes out. And the beautiful part? Once it's established, conservatorship proceedings become moot. Can't control assets that are already in an irrevocable trust. We made plans to meet after my appointment with Edward. I hung up feeling something I hadn't felt since finding that $20 bill. Hope. Helen knocked on my door that night, carrying 2 cups of chamomile tea. You look different, she said, settling into the chair across from my bed. How so? Like you're planning something. She studied me over her cup. Like Earl used to look when he was about to bluff his way to a poker win. I thought about the will, about Edward and Sylvia, about the chess pieces I was quietly moving into place. They expect me to fight like a mother, I said, all emotion and tears and pleading for my son to remember who I am. But I'm not going to fight like a mother. I'm going to fight like a bookkeeper. Every receipt filed, every number balanced, every legal loophole exploited. Helen smiled. Good for you. I lay awake that night thinking about Daniel as a boy, how he'd insisted on wearing his Superman cape to grocery stores, how he'd brought me dandelions and called them flowers, how he'd cried when he accidentally broke my favorite mug and I'd told him things could be replaced but people couldn't. When had that boy become a man who could abandon his mother at a rest stop? When had I become something to be managed rather than someone to be loved? It didn't matter, I supposed. What mattered now was protecting myself from the stranger my son had become. In the morning, I would begin building my fortress, the Silver Pine Trust, a legal shelter that would protect everything Arthur and I had built together. Daniel thought he was playing chess while I was still learning checkers. He was about to learn that his mother had been playing this game far longer than he'd been alive, and I never did learn how to lose gracefully. Edward Price's office hadn't changed in 20 years. The same leather-bound books lined the walls. The same photo of him shaking hands with the mayor sat on his desk. The same smell of pipe tobacco clung to everything despite his wife making him quit a decade ago. "Margaret." He stood when his secretary showed me in, his face grave. "I've been expecting this call for years." "You have?" He gestured to a chair and poured me coffee from a silver pot. Real china cups, not the paper ones most offices use now. Edward still did things the old way. "Arthur was my friend for 40 years, he said, settling behind his desk. "He came to me after Malcolm's situation, said he wanted insurance against his children ever treating you that way. And you helped him create it." "I did more than that." Edward opened a file cabinet and pulled out a thick folder. "I've been documenting everything, every time Daniel came here asking about your finances, every time Lauren called pretending to be concerned about your welfare, date, time, nature of inquiry, all of it." My hands shook slightly as I took the folder, page after page of Edward's neat handwriting, chronicling my son's slow campaign to position himself for control. "The first inquiry was 3 years ago," Edward said quietly. "Right after Arthur's funeral, Daniel wanted to know about the estate, about future inheritance. I told him everything was in order and he'd have to wait. He didn't like that." 3 years. My son had been planning this for 3 years. "The trust Arthur created," I said, pushing past the pain. "Can we activate it?" "Already started the paperwork. But Margaret, you need to understand what this means. Once we do this, there's no going back. The Silver Pine Trust will hold everything, the house, the investments, the savings. You'll control it all. But it will be beyond Daniel's reach forever. Even after I die." I finished the sentence he was too polite to complete. "Good." Edward studied me over his glasses. "He's still your son?" "No," I said firmly. "My son died somewhere between the boy who brought me dandelions and the man who left me at a rest stop. I don't know this person who changes locks and files conservatorship papers. This is just business now." We spent the next 2 hours going through documents. Edward had been thorough, every asset cataloged, every account noted. The trust would be ironclad, he assured me. Daniel could file all the papers he wanted, but he couldn't touch what was no longer technically mine. Sylvia Dalton was waiting when I arrived at her house that afternoon, where Edward's office had been frozen in time. Sylvia's home office was sleek and modern. Multiple computer monitors, a scanner that looked like it could launch satellites, and filing systems I couldn't begin to understand. Digital records, she explained, fingers flying over the keyboard. Paper can be destroyed, but properly backed up digital files are forever. She'd already drawn up the trust documents, the Silver Pine Trust, named after the street where Arthur and I had lived in our first apartment. Young and broke and deliriously happy. "It's elegant," she said, showing me the structure. "You're the sole trustee during your lifetime. You can live in the house, use the money, make any decisions you want, but technically, you don't own any of it. The trust does. And when I die, that's the beautiful part." Sylvia pulled up another document. "The trust continues, managed by an independent firm. Distributions can be made to beneficiaries, but under strict conditions, no lump sums, no immediate access. Just monthly allowances, and only if they meet certain criteria." "What kind of criteria?" "Whatever you want. Regular employment, no criminal convictions, and my personal favorite, no attempts to have the trustee declared incompetent." I laughed. Actually laughed, for the first time since this nightmare began. "Can we really do that?" "Honey, you can put whatever conditions you want. I had one client require her son to volunteer at a soup kitchen every week for a year before he could receive a penny. Another mandated family therapy. The courts uphold these things as long as they're not discriminatory or impossible to achieve. We refined the terms over cups of tea and store-bought cookies. By the time I left, the trust was more than just a financial shelter. It was my declaration of independence. Helen was waiting on her porch when I got home. Her home, I reminded myself, not mine. How did it go? "I'm building a fortress," I told her, "one they can't breach." That night, Daniel called again. I almost didn't answer, but some perverse curiosity made me pick up. "Mom," he said, and he sounded tired. The medical evaluation is in 3 days. If you just cooperate, we can make this easy. Easy for whom? For everyone. The facility we've found is beautiful. Private room, gardens, activities. You'll be taken care of. Like a prize poodle in a kennel. That's not... Mom, please, you're not well. The stove incident, the confusion at the rest stop. You mean when you abandoned me? I kept my voice level. When you changed my locks, those incidents? Silence. Then Lauren's voice in the background, urgent and low. We're trying to help you, Daniel said finally. No, I said. You're trying to help yourselves to what isn't yours. But you're too late. What do you mean? You'll find out soon enough. Oh, and Daniel? You might want to start looking for a new job. Brennan and Associates has standards about their attorney's personal conduct. Edward Price plays poker with Jim Brennan every Thursday. Amazing what comes up in conversation over cards. I hung up while he was still sputtering. Tomorrow. I would sign the papers. The Silver Pine Trust would spring to life, a legal entity with one purpose, protecting everything I'd worked for from the son who'd forgotten how to love the woman who'd given him life. It wasn't the revenge I wanted. What I wanted was my son back, the real one, the one who'd existed before greed and Lauren and whatever else had poisoned him against me. But that son was gone. All I had left was this stranger who saw me as an obstacle to his inheritance. Well, he was about to learn that some obstacles were insurmountable, especially when they'd spent 30 years balancing other people's books and knew exactly where every penny should go. The invitation arrived 2 weeks later, delivered by courier to Helen's door. Cream-colored cardstock, Daniel's law firm letterhead, Lauren's perfect calligraphy. You are cordially invited to a family dinner celebrating new beginnings. Saturday, 7 p.m. Your presence would mean the world to us. Helen read it over my shoulder. A trap. Obviously. I turned the card over. Nothing on the back, but I could read between the lines. They'd discovered the trust. Their legal maneuvers had hit a wall. Now they were trying honey instead of vinegar. Will you go? I thought about it. The trust was signed, sealed, and legally bulletproof. The house, my house, was now owned by a legal entity they couldn't touch. The bank accounts had been transferred. Even my grandmother's jewelry was safely cataloged and stored in a trust-owned safety deposit box. Yes, I decided, but not alone. The night of the dinner, I dressed carefully. Not the comfortable slacks and cardigans I'd taken to wearing at Helen's, but my navy suit, the one I'd worn to Arthur's funeral. Pearl earrings he'd given me for our 30th anniversary. My mother's cameo brooch, armor disguised as accessories. Helen drove me, but Edward Price met us at the curb. I'd asked him to come as my witness, and he'd agreed immediately. You sure about this, Margaret? They want to pretend we're still a happy family. I said, let them pretend. But I want someone there who knows the truth. My key still didn't work, of course. Lauren answered the door, her smile so bright it could have powered the neighborhood. She wore a cocktail dress and heels, as if this were a party instead of an ambush. Mother Hale, you look wonderful. And Mr. Price, what a lovely surprise. The house smelled like rosemary chicken. My recipe, I noted with a twist of bitter amusement. They'd even used my good china, the wedding set that had survived 43 years only to be handled by the woman who'd helped lock me out. Daniel stood by the fireplace, a glass of wine in hand. He'd gained weight. I noticed. Stress eating, perhaps, good. Mom. He crossed the room to kiss my cheek. I let him, though my skin crawled at the contact. I'm so glad you came. Wouldn't miss it, I said coolly. Other guests materialized from the kitchen. Jim and Patricia Walker from down the street, the same neighbors who'd signed affidavits about my concerning behavior. Doctor. Michael Harrison, who golfed with Daniel. Rebecca Martinez, Lauren's book club friend who happened to be a social worker. A jury of my peers, assembled to witness my capitulation. Dinner's almost ready. Lauren announced, "Why don't we all sit?" They'd rearranged my dining room. The table Arthur had built in his workshop was still there, but they'd covered it with a new tablecloth. My grandmother's candlesticks had been replaced with modern ones. Even the art on the walls was different. They were already erasing me. Conversation during the meal was carefully orchestrated. Safe topics: the weather, the neighbor's new dog, anything but the elephant in the room. I ate mechanically, noting that Lauren had overcooked the chicken and under-seasoned the potatoes. My recipes, butchered, finally, over dessert, store-bought tiramisu, not even the decency to attempt homemade. Daniel cleared his throat. "Mom, we wanted to gather everyone here tonight because family is important, and sometimes families go through difficult transitions." Here it came. "We know the last few weeks have been challenging," Lauren added, reaching across the table as if to take my hand. I moved it to my lap. "But we want you to know that we love you and only want what's best. Which is why," Daniel continued, "we found a wonderful solution that works for everyone." He produced papers from somewhere, probably hidden under his napkin like a magician's trick. "Golden Years Senior Community has agreed to hold a room for you. It's a beautiful facility. Mom, independent living, but with support when you need it. All you have to do," Lauren said sweetly, "is sign these papers agreeing to the move. We'll handle everything else. Selling the house, managing the finances. You won't have to worry about anything." The room was silent. Everyone watched me, waiting for the confused old woman to gratefully accept her children's help. I took a sip of wine. My wine, I noted, from the case Arthur had been saving, and set the glass down carefully. "No." Daniel blinked. "Mom, be reasonable." I said no. I turned to address the room. "For those of you here under the impression you're witnessing a helpful family intervention, let me clarify the situation. 6 weeks ago, my son and daughter-in-law abandoned me at a rest stop with $20 and changed the locks on my home. They then filed papers to have me declared incompetent so they could seize my assets." Patricia Walker's fork clattered to her plate. "That's not—" Daniel started. "I have documentation," I continued calmly. "Witness statements, phone records, the locksmith's receipt. Would you like to see them, Patricia, since you were so concerned about my deteriorating mental state that you signed an affidavit?" Patricia's face flushed crimson. "Furthermore," I said, standing slowly, "any attempts to pursue conservatorship will fail. The house, the accounts, everything now belongs to the Silver Pine Trust, of which I am the sole trustee. You can't steal what you can't touch." "Mom!" Daniel stood too, his face mottled with anger. "This is ridiculous. You need help." "What I needed," I said quietly, "was a son who didn't abandon his mother for money. What I needed was family who saw me as a person, not a problem to be solved." I looked around the table at their shocked faces. "But since I don't have that, I've made other arrangements." "Edward?" Edward Price stood, pulling a document from his jacket. "Mr. Hale, this is a cease and desist order. Any further attempts to harass Mrs. Hale, file false legal claims, or access her property will result in criminal charges." "This is insane," Lauren hissed. "She's clearly having some kind of breakdown." "The only breakdown," I said, gathering my purse, "is the one happening to your plans. Enjoy the dinner. It's the last meal you'll eat in my house." I walked toward the door. Edward beside me. Behind us. Daniel called out, desperate now. "Mom, please, let's talk about this. We're family." I stopped at the threshold of the dining room. My dining room, where I'd hosted countless holiday meals, birthday parties, Sunday dinners, where Arthur had proposed to me over pot roast, where Daniel had told us Lauren was pregnant with Emily. Family. I turned back one last time. Family doesn't abandon you at a rest stop. Family doesn't change locks. Family doesn't try to throw you away when you become inconvenient. I looked directly at my son, searching for any trace of the boy he'd been. Finding nothing. "You're not my family," I said. "You're just strangers living in my house, and that's about to change." The silence that followed my words was complete. Even the grandfather clock in the hallway, Arthur's pride and joy, seemed to pause its ticking. I stood at the threshold, my hand on the door frame, watching the color drain from Daniel's face. "You can't be serious," Lauren finally whispered. "This is your son. Is he?" I reached into my purse, my fingers finding the document I'd been saving for this moment, because the son I raised wouldn't have done this. I unfolded Arthur's original will, not a copy, but the actual document with his shaky signature from those last months when his hands had trembled, but his mind remained sharp. The paper was worn soft from his handling, and I could still smell the faint cologne he'd always worn. "Before anyone claims I'm confused or forgetful," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the room, "let me read you something. Arthur's words, not mine." I found the passage he'd insisted on adding, over my protests that it wasn't necessary. "If my son Daniel or any of my heirs attempts through legal manipulation, coercion, or abandonment to strip my beloved wife Margaret of her dignity, autonomy, or assets, they shall forfeit all rights to inheritance. This includes, but is not limited to, attempts at conservatorship without genuine medical cause, isolation from her home, or financial manipulation." I looked up at the assembled guests. "He wrote this 3 months before he died. Sound mind, witnesses present, including you. Doctor Harrison, you were one of the witnesses, weren't you?" Michael Harrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Margaret, that was years ago. 4 years, 2 months, and 6 days. I said. "I know exactly how long ago it was. Just like I know that Daniel started asking Edward about my finances 3 years ago. Just like I know that Lauren called Adult Protective Services last month with concerns about my welfare. How did you—" Lauren started, then stopped. "The investigator told me," I said simply. "After she found no evidence of self-neglect or cognitive decline, she was quite apologetic about wasting my time. I turned the page of the will, finding the next relevant section, around the table. The dinner guests sat frozen, witnesses to a family destruction they'd never anticipated when they'd accepted tonight's invitation. Evidence of such behavior," I continued reading, "shall include documentation of abandonment, defined as leaving Margaret stranded without transportation or communication, changing locks on shared property without consent, or filing false reports with authorities." "Mom, please," Daniel's voice cracked. "This isn't necessary. We can work this out privately." "Privately?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Like when you privately abandoned me at that rest stop? Like when you privately changed the locks? No. Daniel, you made this public when you invited these people here to witness my supposed surrender." I held up the will so everyone could see Arthur's signature, the official seal, the witnesses' names clearly visible. "But here's the beauty of Arthur's foresight," I said. "The will specifies that attempted coercion triggers an immediate redistribution of assets, not to Daniel, not to any family member who participated in or knew about the abandonment." "Then who?" Lauren demanded, her composure finally cracking. I smiled then, thinking of Arthur's wicked sense of humor, how he'd chuckled when adding this particular clause. "The Brighton Mills Cooperative Employee Pension Fund," I said. "Every penny that would have gone to Daniel will instead help provide for the retirement of people who actually worked for their money." The explosion was immediate. Daniel lunging to his feet, sending his wine glass toppling. Lauren's shriek of outrage. Patricia Walker pushing back from the table as red wine spread across my grandmother's tablecloth. Ruined now, like so many other things. "You can't do this," Daniel shouted. "I'm your son, your only child." "You were," I agreed, "but you stopped being my son the moment you left me at that rest stop, the moment you decided I was an obstacle rather than your mother." Edward stepped forward. "Ever the professional. Mr. Hale, I'd advise you to remain calm. Any threatening behavior will only strengthen the case against you." "Case?" Daniel turned on him. "What case?" "Fraud, for starters," Edward said mildly. "Filing false statements with the court, elder abuse, potentially, certainly attempted financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult." "She's not vulnerable," Lauren snapped. "This whole thing proves she's completely capable." She stopped, realizing what she'd just admitted. "Thank you." "Lauren," I said softly. "Edward, did you get that recorded?" Edward patted his jacket pocket where I could see the outline of his phone. Every word. Margaret. The room erupted again, chairs scraping, voices raised, someone crying, through it all. I stood quietly, watching the family dinner become a family funeral. Finally, when the chaos had died to murmurs, I spoke again. The trust takes effect immediately. You have 30 days to vacate my house. Your personal belongings will be professionally packed and delivered to wherever you're living. The locks will be changed tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. sharp. 30 days? Daniel's voice was hoarse. Where are we supposed to go? I found somewhere in less than an hour, I reminded him. Of course. I only had $20 and the clothes on my back. You have jobs, savings, a car that actually runs. You'll manage. I looked around the room one last time, at the neighbors who'd whispered about me, at the doctor who'd been ready to declare me incompetent, at the social worker who'd been prepared to help stuff me into a facility. For those of you who signed affidavits or were prepared to testify about my supposed decline, I said, Edward will be in touch about potential defamation suits. I'd suggest you contact your attorneys. Patricia Walker made a small, wounded sound. I turned back to Daniel and Lauren, who stood among the wreckage of their scheme, wine-stained tablecloth, scattered papers, their carefully constructed image of concerned children in ruins. One last thing, I said. Emily can still visit me. She's innocent in this, and I won't punish her for your choices. But she'll visit me at my home, on my terms. And if you try to poison her against me or use her as a weapon, that privilege will end too. Daniel's face went through a series of expressions, anger, disbelief, and finally, something that might have been regret, but it was too late for regret. Far too late. Mom, he said quietly, I never meant for it to go this far. Yes, I said simply. You did. You just never meant to get caught. I turned and walked through my front door, my door, which would soon lock out the strangers who'd tried to steal my life. Edward followed, and I heard him pause to address the room. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd suggest you leave now. This property will be secured by private security within the hour. Any attempts to remove items not specifically belonging to Mr. and Mrs. Hale will be considered theft. The cool night air hit my face as I stepped onto the porch. My porch, where I'd planted those roses, where Arthur had built that swing, where Daniel had taken his first steps. Behind me, I heard Laurent's voice shrill with rage. This isn't over. But she was wrong. It was over. Completely, utterly, irrevocably over. The strangers in my house had learned what happened when they mistook kindness for weakness, when they assumed age meant helplessness, when they forgot that Margaret Hale had been balancing books and settling accounts long before they'd ever thought to challenge her. I walked to Helen's car, my back straight, my head high. Justice, served at room temperature, with a side of consequences they'd be tasting for years to come. The morning sun streamed through Helen's kitchen window as I signed the last document. Edward had arrived at 7:30 sharp, briefcase in hand and a satisfied smile on his face. The locksmith is already at your house, he informed me. New locks, new security system. Daniel and Lauren were served with formal eviction papers at 7:15 this morning. How did they take it? About as well as you'd expect. There was shouting, some threats. Officer Martinez was present to ensure compliance. He slid another paper across to me. Speaking of which, this is the restraining order. Temporary for now, but given the evidence, making it permanent shouldn't be difficult. I signed where he indicated, my hand steady. Each signature felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. Helen poured coffee for all of us, her good china clinking softly. So what happens now? Now, Edward said, organizing the papers back into his briefcase. Margaret goes home. Home. The word tasted sweet. 2 hours later, I stood in my own doorway again. The new keys were heavy in my hand, solid brass, nothing like the flimsy aluminum ones Daniel had installed. Inside, the house was chaos. Furniture moved, drawers left open, closets ransacked. They'd been looking for hidden assets, no doubt. Too bad everything important had been in Helen's attic or Edward's safe. I walked through each room slowly, cataloging the damage. My wedding china was gone. They must have packed it in their hurry. Several photo albums, too. Let them have those memories. They'd already destroyed the reality behind them. In what had been Daniel's old room, now their guest room, I found Emily's backpack. Inside, a note in her careful handwriting. Grandma, I don't understand everything that's happening, but I know you're not sick or confused. I'm sorry about the rest stop. I love you. M. I held the note to my chest, the first tears I'd allowed myself finally falling. The next weeks passed in a blur of cleaning, reorganizing, reclaiming. The security company installed cameras, discreet but comprehensive. A cleaning service dealt with the wine stains and the mess, slowly. My house became mine again. Daniel tried everything. Lawyers who sent threatening letters that Edward swatted away like flies. Flying monkeys. Mutual friends who called with sob stories about how devastated he was. Even a pastor who showed up uninvited to counsel me about forgiveness. I have forgiven him, I told the pastor. Offering him tea he didn't accept. I've forgiven him and released him from my life. Those aren't the same thing as reconciliation. Lauren took a different approach. She started a social media campaign about elder abuse, carefully edited to make them the victims. Of course, screenshots found their way to me courtesy of Emily, who remained my secret ally. The comments weren't kind to Lauren. Turns out, abandoning your elderly mother-in-law at a rest stop doesn't play well on Facebook. The best moment came 6 weeks later. Daniel had gotten a new job. His reputation at Brennan and Associates hadn't survived Edward's poker game revelations. He'd applied for a mortgage for a modest house across town. The loan officer, following standard procedure, had called to verify his inheritance expectations. I'm sorry, I told the young man on the phone. There must be some misunderstanding. My son has no inheritance. That's all been allocated to charity. The loan was denied 3 months after that dinner. I sat in my garden where my roses bloomed and my tomatoes grew and no one could lock me out. Helen sat beside me, sharing the comfortable silence of old friends. Any regrets? She asked. I thought about it, about Daniel as a baby, as a boy, as the man who'd chosen greed over love, about the family dinners that would never happen, the grandchildren I might never fully know, the sun-shaped hole in my heart. No, I said finally. Grief, yes. Sorrow for what could have been, but no regrets. My phone buzzed. Emily, asking if she could come by after school. I smiled and texted back, always. The trust Edward and Sylvia had helped me create was more than just legal protection. It was freedom. The monthly income was mine to spend or save. The house was mine to live in. And when my time came, everything would go to the pension fund to help people who'd worked hard their whole lives, just like Arthur and I had. Daniel and Lauren's 30 days had come and gone. They'd moved to a rental on the other side of town. I heard things occasionally, that he was drinking too much, that she'd started looking for jobs outside the state, that their marriage was strained. I felt no satisfaction in their struggles, but I felt no guilt either. They'd made their choices that day at the rest stop. Every consequence since had been of their own making. The Silver Pine Trust stood strong, protecting not just my assets, but my autonomy. I'd named Edward as successor trustee, with Sylvia as backup. Even if something did happen to my cognitive abilities someday, I'd chosen my own protectors. People who'd proven their loyalty when it mattered. The afternoon sun warmed my face as I stood to go inside. My house, my garden, my life. I'd learned something valuable through all of this. Family isn't just about blood. It's about choosing to love, choosing to protect, choosing to stand by someone when leaving would be easier. Helen had been more family to me in my darkest moment than my own son. Edward and Sylvia had protected me like the siblings I'd never had. As for Daniel, he taught me the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the greatest act of self-love is walking away from those who would destroy you, even if they share your DNA. I paused at my front door, with my locks, protecting my home, and looked back at the garden one more time. Everything was in bloom, vibrant and alive, just like me. The strangers who'd tried to steal my life had failed. The mother they'd underestimated had prevailed, and somewhere in the distance, Arthur was probably laughing, proud of his Maggie for fighting dirty when it mattered. I turned my key in the lock and stepped inside, closing the door firmly behind me. The end. Thank you for listening to my story. I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts. What would you have done in Margaret's situation? Your comments and experiences mean the world to me.